can opener on my knife. I use that for a lot of things. Well, welcome back to the part of the Bean Energy channel where I get to fix my past mistakes. As you can see, I've got a whole pile of these batteries back here, and as I've noted on my channel here,
if they had stayed more or less in balance, it would have been fine, but they're not.
I've had some problems with them. I had two separate systems where I had these 4 in series to make a 48 volt battery pack to run some solar storage.
I've been really excited about sharing this inverter with you guys.
And in both scenarios, at least one of the batteries, what I assume, wasn't able to cut off. The BMS wasn't able to shut off that 48 volts. And that one battery took all of its cells, or multiple of its cells, down below 2.5 volts. I've tested one of them, and I think I had a video up here on the channel where the battery ended up being at about 3/4 capacity after that. So thankful that it didn't completely die, but the fact that it had, less than 100 cycles on it and now it's down to 3/4 capacity is really sad. Since then, I did put it into a 48 volt scenario with a 16S BMS, and that battery had some real problems with being able to do sustained loads. So the voltage on that one cell would drop really drastically if I tried to actually load it anywhere close to, say, 30, 40 amps. Much less the 100 amps that the batteries were originally made for. So today, what I'm going to be looking at is, 1, the preventative, and 2, what to do if, something does happen to your batteries and have to fix them. So anyway, we're going through this, what I'm doing. So I've got a battery that I fixed and is charging here. I've got these 5 and this one here. So this one here is okay. It's at 13.1 volts. It was in a 48 volt setup, but it was not one of the ones that failed internally. So this is going to be an example of what I would do for preventative maintenance. Preventative maintenance being getting rid of the internal BMS that this thing has currently, because it is apparently junk. When I originally tested these batteries, they did test okay. They were able to pull 100 amps. I did low temperature cutoff, that kind of a thing. After getting more of them, I realized the quality control was not there, and some of them didn't work right. And in my 48 volt setup here, if you've seen my 5,000 watt Palmister video, where I've got the cabinet with the 4 blue batteries in it, 2 of those batteries actually failed and we're sitting at like 10 volts internally, which is much too low, because at least one of their cells is well below the 2.5 volts. Because no, they're not perfectly balanced, which was the other thing. The BMS in here didn't balance the batteries. So I've taken this apart before, and we're about to go through that. But what I want to show you right now is what I chose for a BMS. So I like the Shawshang brand of BMS. It has a really great Bluetooth app for iPhone. It also has a Bluetooth app for Android, which does work. You have to find the right one, and sometimes you have to sideload it. But it's a great app, great BMS. I haven't had any of them fail. And right here, I've got 3 of them. And don't be like me and choose the cheapest and expect it to work. So I bought this, and I was like, oh, this will work. And it came in, and first thing I noticed was there's no wires on it, which is fine. I can solder wires on there. The other thing I noticed was that there's hardly anything else like populated on the circuit board. And what I realized that this is very much like the BMS that is already in here. It has no balancing. So that's kind of silly. And I think I only paid 40 bucks a piece for these, which is why I did it, because it was like, oh, that's much less expensive. I could do that and not have a whole lot of money into it by the time I'm done. But that's the only thing it has on here is sense leads right here. And there's no temperature sensors, so probably no low temperature shutoff, which I definitely want for lithium iron phosphate battery. So that's kind of junk, because I'd have to add a balancer to it. And by the time I add a balancer to it, I've spent what I would spend on something like this. So this is what I usually use for building my packs, because I was doing that partly because it didn't have Bluetooth. I was like, I don't really need Bluetooth. They're just 12 volt batteries. So this one does have the Bluetooth. It costs a little more. I think this one's more like 75, 100 bucks. It has the Bluetooth. It has the temperature. This one came with wires that were coming off of here. And what I've done is I pulled the wires out and I put in the same terminals that came off of the internal BMS here, which I'll show you in just a minute. So that's an option. The problem with this one was, and if I bought it now, it would probably be fine. the connector. And I'll show you what it looks like internally, but basically this here is the same type of connector that is inside of these blue batteries, and it's already on this BMS. This one here looks a little bit different, and it seems to be an older style. The newer JBD Shawshang BMSs that I get have the newer style, and so I don't want to use this because that would mean having to rewire the connector, and I just would rather not if I'm doing a bunch of these batteries. So those two BMSs are out. This one here is a bit overkill for what I need. As you can see, it's much bigger. Now this was a 100 amp, the protection board is what I would call that. This one is a 120 amp, and it's a BMS because it actually has balancing, low temperature cutoff, that type of thing. This one is a 100 amp BMS, even though it looks much beefier than the 120. Could be just they were using different kinds of MOSFETs. This one has heater control. So it has a terminal that you could run a heater, and I was gonna play around with that. I haven't yet. Also has its 2 temperature sensors, so it has low temperature cutoff. It has the sense leads that will plug right in. So like I don't need this harness because the harness that's already in here is gonna plug right in. And it has Bluetooth, which is a nice bonus to have. It's just that this is more like 125 bucks. Which is fine. It'll get my battery back up and running. So this is what we're going to use. The one disadvantage is that the holes here for the B- and B and C-, the B-, C-, are slightly bigger. So these are like an M8, and the holes on the original BMS in here are an M6. So I will need to drill out the holes in here. But let's go ahead and pop this guy open, and we can take a look at what's inside. Technically, all these BMSs would work, especially the 2 that are the smart BMSs. The protection board, if you didn't need the cold temperature protection, then, I mean, you could do the protection board. If you needed the balancing, could always do a separate balancer, like a little active balancer inside of there. I think I've got a video showing how I put my Heltec active balancer in there. It's just that those are another like 25 bucks or so, which sometimes doesn't really make sense to spend. You know, you could spend that extra 25 bucks on the smart BMS instead of spending it on the dumb BMS or the dumb protection board and a balancer that's separate. And it would be easier too, right? Because the connector just plugs right in. All right, so we'll get that guy off, and we have 2 more little plugs to take out down here. So this was I'm using a 3/16 Allen head, is what took off the bigger ones for the handle. And then this one is a T15 Torx, which will get all the little screws out. Something I do like about these batteries, and I've mentioned before, is the ability to maintain them, pulling them apart without actually hurting the battery, without having to cut the case. So, you know, there's that. Now, this procedure could work with other batteries, other brands that have a similar problem where the BMS is inferior. I just can't guarantee they'd be able to come apart as nice as these global power batteries. All right. So this is what it looks like inside. I had not torn this one apart before. So just an explanation of what we got going on. Obviously, this is the positive terminal that goes to the first cell pack. These are the, 32650 cells, and there's like 20 of them in each pack. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 cells or cell groups, and they're just connected. They've got like 5 12 gauge wires that run to a terminal, and you can see they've just covered it up in shrink tape or shrink wrap and bolted them together. So that's the main positive, and then it runs in a series down the line, and then you've got the main negative that runs to the BMS, and then from the BMS up into the top of the battery. And then you've got this little connector here, which I'm not going to take apart, that runs the little screen that you can see what voltage the battery is at and the rough capacity that's left. And that actually runs straight to the battery. that does not run through the BMS. And then you've got just the little connector here that I was talking about earlier that is the same type of connector that's on the BMS that I chose. So that's what's going to be handy, is I just unplug this BMS. The only other things that this BMS is plugged into are the B-, C-, and then whatever temperature sensors or circuit breakers that it's got. So I'm just going to tape off this thing. Just stay over there, would you, buddy? And off of this little circuit breaker deal-em-a-bob. And I really don't care too much about this. Technically, this BMS does still work, but I'm certainly not going to be reusing it because I know that it would eventually fail. At least I'm fairly certain of that. I suppose I could, like, you know, unscrew these. I'll be doing another video on this because a lot of people have asked about the Connectees and 48 volt configuration and what BMS we could swap in that would do that, because the BMS that I'm swapping in here is not going to allow that. The MOSFETs, and that's the big deal with being able to run 48 volts with these 4 batteries in series, is the MOSFETs inside the BMS have to be able to support shutting off up to 60 volts. And that is not the case with these. I think these are 30 volt MOSFETs. So they're only good for, you might be able to do a 24 volt battery, but they're not sold as that, right? This is a 12 volt battery. I'm sticking it in here. You can put them in parallel, that's fine, but not in series. And I'm ordering some BMSs that can in fact go up to, the MOSFETs are good for 80 volts, which would be plenty for a 48 volt setup. So I am gonna keep 4 of these batteries, swap in one of those 80 volt BMSs and test it to see if it works. And I'll provide how to get a hold of those BMSs if that works. But for now, we will just act like these are going to be 12 volt batteries, which they are. And I'll just need to mark on the front that says you can connect them in 48 volt and say, no, you cannot. These are only for 12 volt configurations. All right, so there is the BMS. And you can see that all I did on this BMS here was I unsoldered the terminals here and soldered them back onto this BMS. And that is handy. It requires quite a bit of soldering iron. I've got like a 200 watt or a 250 watt big old heavy duty iron. This guy here. No, it's a 175, but it's got all this thermal mass up in the tip and the iron itself. And using that, I can get them to unsolder. It was pretty difficult with my gun iron that didn't really have any thermal mass. That was a 300 watt. So it's possible, just requires a lot of soldering iron. And I prefer if I can just bolt things in. So this is live. Make sure that this doesn't touch, say, like this positive terminal, because sparks would fly, things would be shorted out. So be very careful of that. The next thing I need to do here is drill this out. The reason I need to drill it out is because these are, let me get these other BMSs that I'm not using out of the way. These are the screws that will fit into this BMS. And these are M8, I believe is the size, whereas these are M6 holes and definitely do not fit. So it's unfortunate and it's annoying, but this is what I'm gonna do. I'm hoping that those BMSs that I'm ordering already come with M6 holes, and it would make this really easy because you could just move it over. Don't have to drill it out. But I'm gonna just drill this out to M8. I'm sure that I'm actually drilling it out to some standard measurement, not a metric measurement, but M6 is 1/4 inch, right? So 5/16 is probably what I'm going to for an M8. And then M10 would be a 3/8. One thing to watch out for when drilling this out is leaving a bunch of burrs that aren't going to allow the ring terminal to sit flat. Handy thing with this step bit is that after I make the initial hole, I can keep drilling a little bit and it'll kind of taper that edge and pull off, deburr it basically, right? So let's see how this looks. I'm gonna watch out for that. When it gets to the end, it likes to grab and rip your arm off. You'll notice that I wasn't going very fast, and that was why. All right. So I don't know if you're able to see this. Hopefully I'll be able to zoom in on it. But you can see that there's quite a bit of a burr on there, especially on the far side. So let's see if we can get that deburred with my step bit. This is gonna be the longest part of the whole process probably, is just drilling out and deburring these. Everything else is pretty simple on these things. Can opener on my knife. I use that for a lot of things. Curious, how many of y'all actually use this as a can opener? And do you know how it works as a can opener? It was known for taking cans of chili for lunch to work or to school. And I would just use my Leatherman to open it. All right, got those cleaned up as much as we can. Okay, so now that those holes are made, we just need to set this BMS inside. Ideally, in this configuration. Not that this tape's gonna do much good, but honestly something I found is it likes to sit up against here, and I need a little bit of space to be able to get the lid on. And this series connection here is kind of in the way of my oversized BMS. Let's see if I can get that tucked out of the way like that. Yeah, there we go. So that'll sit great right there. I like to not connect the sense leads until I have to, just so that less things are powered up until I get everything connected. Let me grab some tape, just so that this thing's not flopping around too much. Probably not the ideal tape for this. Right here, because I'm not using that heater. I'm not using that heater terminal, so I can just stick some across there. It's not moving too bad. The big thing is you don't really want the BMS to come flying up and hit either of these terminals, which there's going to be like wires up on top of the BMS, which should keep it pressed up against the battery, but just something to consider. So you've got B- and C-. If you've ever done BMSs before, it's clear, but B- goes to your battery, B for battery. C- goes to charging for C. It's also the load. They did at one point, and they do still have BMSs that have separate load and charging circuits. You'll see that on a lot of like scooters, batteries and stuff. You'll charge it from one circuit and discharge from another. Don't really know why necessarily, but with solar storage batteries, it's in and out the same hole because, you know, your inverter charger is going to do the same thing. It's going to charge and discharge. So anyway, I'm going to stack these connectors like so and see if I can get them onto our terminal. Let's see. Those are going to go right there. I did put a lock washer on my my bolt. I just kind of snugged it. I'll come back with my hand screwdriver and put some torque on that. And then this guy, what am I going to do with my temperature sensors? I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stuff these. They've got, the 4 packs are individually shrink wrapped, and then they shrink wrapped all 4 together before they dropped it in here. So I'm just gonna stuff my temperature sensor down between the outside shrink wrap and the cells. Let's see if I can get this one down a different side of the battery here. There we go. So it'll measure a different part of the battery. And then we need to connect our C- side. And this will be up to our charge port, terminal on the top. Let's put that through there, and into there. Okay, so those are snug, and I've got my Phillips head screwdriver here. And they'll take quite a bit of torque. I just wanted to do it by hand because that seems safer. All right. Okay, so I put this one on, but the thing is the wire is like bumping up against the lid of the BMS. And I really don't like that because if it ever ate through the insulation, it would not be ideal, because then you could end up with, you know, bypassing the BMS or something if this lid is hot. So I just turned it a little bit so that the wires are no longer touching the lid of the BMS. Let's see, this one's doing the same thing. Oh, but you know what? I just bent it up, so that'll be fine. All right, so that one's tight. That one's tight. And our Bluetooth, we can just stuff down in here somewhere. And our sense leads can be connected. I'm just double checking as I pause. So B- goes to the battery, C- to the lid. Plug our sense leads in. And then we can button this thing back up. Now this one didn't have any, it was not over discharged in the first place, so no reason to think that we need any special balancing or special care. We're just replacing a BMS that was currently working. It does have this seal around the edge, which, I don't know, seems a little excessive for a battery that, you know, shouldn't be seeing the weather anyway, but I'm just gonna stuff this back into its ridge before I screw the lid back on. And we'll put this one on the charger. One thing that will be bad inside of this is the top balancing, because even if it was balanced from the factory, I did cycle this battery a few times, so who knows what kind of internal balancing was happening at all. Well, there wasn't any internal balancing happening, we know that, because these BMSs didn't have internal balancing. The question is, how balanced were they naturally? It's probably going to be a little bit of a tight fit, but it should pop on. What does it hit? Oh, I'm just not, I wasn't lining it up correctly. All right. So yeah, it's going to be a tight fit. That's all right. So still at 13.1 volts, obviously. Let me grab my tablet here and we'll see what the cells look like inside. Now, where did I stick my tablet? I know I plugged it into charge, but where did I plug it into charge? There it is. While I'm waiting on the tablet to boot up, I'm going to show you guys, if you haven't seen it already, what the MOSFETs look like compared to the JBD BMSs. And I did show these on the first video that I did about these batteries. I don't know if I've actually got that up still. I think I've just got a big old disclaimer that I don't recommend these batteries anymore. So this is what the MOSFETs look like on this one. So the big deal, two big things. One, there's only 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 of them, which seems really low on numbers. But numbers aren't everything, because it could be that they are high current MOSFETs. What's weird though is that they've sanded off any model numbers from the top of the MOSFETs. So I literally don't even know what these things are rated for because they've defaced them so that you can't tell. It's kind of like buying lithium iron phosphate cells from China and they remove or scratch out the QR codes. So you can't even see what battery it was originally. So I know that they probably sell like 260 amp hour cells when they were originally a 280. They just didn't test a 280, and so now they're a 260. But they don't want people looking at the QR codes to see that necessarily, which could be fine, right? It could be that it's just a 260 and it's fine. It's just a larger case than you would get with a 260 typically. Who knows? All right, now this thing's probably gonna be dinging at me for the next 5 minutes as it updates because I haven't had it booted in quite a while. But let's get connected to this thing. This is the Shawshang 2.0 app. And you can just hit jump login. What that means is skip login. They just didn't quite get that translated correctly. So let's connect to the strong BMS. Connection failed. No, it's connecting. It's thinking about it. All right, so this one's definitely got all of our info on there. It's got the individual cell voltages, and it's saying 23.99 amp hours remaining capacity, but it's just guessing right now. It doesn't really know. With these Shawshang BMSs, what you want to do is go into the parameters and make sure, actually, I don't know if, that's one of the things with these, the Android apps, it's like some of the apps allow you to change settings and some of them don't. So that one that I was in didn't have the ability to change settings. But let's go into this other one. I think this is the side-loaded one. And come on. Let's go to the correct BMS here. It's also picking up this other BMS that I've got, which is the same type that I installed over here. Let's go to parameters, origin settings. That doesn't have it either. Anyway, I really like the iPhone app with this. You have to pay like $6 or $8 to be able to change settings, but it works and it's perfect. Anyway, just go ahead and make the settings. Go in there and make sure the settings are right, which they should be. They should be defaulting for lithium iron phosphate, but you want to make sure they're not defaulted to like lithium ion or something and letting them charge to 4.2 volts. So the idea for the Shawshang app, what you want to do is get it, once you get the new BMS in there, discharge it until the BMS shuts off, which is why you'd want to make sure the settings are right, make sure it's like 2.5 volts per cell until it shuts off. Then the BMS knows, hey, that's my lower limit. And then if you charge it all the way back up, that should reset the capacity meter, and it's going to be much more accurate because it will actually measure how much current is going in and out of the battery and use that for capacity meter measurements, unlike a charge controller, which is just using voltage, because it doesn't know how much the inverter's using, or if you've got 12-volt systems or whatever, it doesn't know how much is leaving the battery. All it knows is how much is going into the battery. So they'll typically just use a voltage reading and kind of guesstimate about what capacity the battery's at. The problem is you could have a completely dead battery, start putting, you know, if you've got a 100 amp hour battery and you're putting a 50 amp charge into it, you know, that voltage could go from, oh, I was at 12 volts, now I'm at 13.5 just because it's being charged currently. If you stop charging it, it might drop to 13. So the capacity meter is going to be a little iffy on that if you're just doing it based on voltage. So you will actually have a reliable capacity meter as opposed to this thing, which is also just a voltage reading that's guessing a voltage. So this thing is thinking that it's like almost full, but willing to bet it's not, considering the other batteries that it was with were completely dead to 10 volts and this one was fine for whatever reason. So that is how I swapped it out. Oh, look, I didn't put this guy back in. So you now have the list of tools that you would need, and I'll put links to all these BMSs, but I'll mention the one specifically that I did do in this. And then if you're looking for something that's going to be able to series up to 48 volts, don't do it yet. Wait for me, I mean, you don't have to wait on me, right? But don't use this BMS. I am getting some BMSs in that are supposed to work for 48 volts, so I will test it. But I don't have any doubt that JBD is actually putting the right MOSFETs in. I've never had a problem with JBD. So it's just a matter of me testing it, making sure that I'm comfortable with it before I say, hey, this is great. It works. This BMS is overkill. I could have spliced in the wires and used the cheaper Bluetooth BMS and it would have been fine. But that is one way to fix one of these cheap batteries that's a bad BMS. And it's one of those things, it might be worth having a serviceable battery. Say buying one of these brand new, you can get a BMS for $100. And if you're able to be into the battery for $400 and you have a real good Bluetooth BMS in there, maybe that's worth it. And it's serviceable too, which is really slick. Question is, what's going to break in there? Probably just the BMS, because if the cells break, like, you're not really going to go replace cells really on a battery, right? I mean, I suppose if you had one cell group that went out, you could take the whole thing out and unbolt that one cell group and put one in, which I suppose I could do. These batteries that got over discharged, I think it was just one cell group that got over discharged. So I could take these batteries apart, pull out those cell groups that were really bad, and make a good battery out of it. I was just thinking about that as I'm on camera here. So who knows? Maybe I'll do a video on that too. Be a little more entailed, especially for a $300 battery. Is it worth it? I don't know.